Benji, we're so thankful to have you on the Enneagram and Marriage podcast today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be a part of it.
Well, you guys are doing huge things all over the world and saving so many people's lives from ruin. And we can't thank you enough. Today, we're going to try to change more lives out there.
Mhm.
But as we get started, as our audience becomes familiar with you, or maybe more familiar with you and your work, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, and even if you know your personality type?
Yeah, sure. I grew up in Southern California. I felt very drawn to the arts. Ended up
Mm.
starting out in film school, and during that time, just was wrestling with like how is this gonna fulfill a purpose in the world?
Mhm.
And so my journey was a bit circuitous. I ended up opting to go to Bible school and get a, you know, theological education. Coming out of that, eventually discovered the issue of human trafficking.
Mm.
And that was sort of the catalyst for me that I went, aha, okay, this is where I can marry these two passions, my
Mm.
sort of like deep sense of calling to make a difference in the world,
Yeah.
along with my passion for the arts and for filmmaking and storytelling. And
Yeah.
so that happened back in early 2007 and set me on a 4-year journey working on our first documentary
Mm.
and then just, yeah, opened up a lot of doors for the ministry that I lead, which is called Exodus Cry, to
Mhm.
really address a lot of the real world problems of human trafficking.
Mm. Wow. That is incredible. And I love how you found purpose combined with your artistry to do something powerful, which is interestingly, as we're talking about healing from these wounds of our sexuality,
Mm.
often we need to find purpose. So I'm glad you found
Yeah,
something so beautiful to sink your heart into.
yeah, yeah, for sure. It really was like a burning bush moment. It's not something that human trafficking was not on my radar at all. And I think
Interesting.
that the more that I sort of like held space to process this
Mhm.
grave reality, the
Mhm.
more I was inspired to pray about it, and the more eventually I felt like I need to put feet to my prayers. And so at that time, there was very little awareness on human trafficking. So
Yeah.
it seemed like it made a lot of sense for me to, pick the camera back up and really just to kind of spotlight the reality of what's happening. And
Mhm.
um, so I myself was not super clear on how trafficking operates. There's a lot of, or at that time, there was a lot of information out there about it.
Mhm.
So it ended up being this investigative kind of journey over the course of 4 years, traveling around the world and documenting the different nuances of how trafficking operates in different parts of the world and source countries, destination countries, understanding
Mhm.
supply and demand, the
Wow.
how trafficking operates in
Mhm.
certain countries versus other countries, and anyways, the culmination of that resulted in our first documentary, Nefarious Merchant of Souls, and
Mhm.
that went on to win like 25 film festival awards and
Mhm.
um, we received consultative status at the United Nations, and yeah, just set in motion a lot of projects for us to really begin to get on the front lines of the fight against trafficking. And
Mhm.
so now we've been at this for, yeah, almost, is it 18 years or so. Yeah.
Wow. Oh
So
my
yeah,
goodness, your platform is enormous and across social media, across, like you said, you've had the chance to speak at the United Nations and elsewhere. I know Tim Tebow's wife is going to be speaking at one of your events soon.
right.
I will talk about that event later in case anyone wants to join. But do you know, I know there's a lot of artistry with our introverts, with our Enneagram fours, fives. Do you know your temperament by any chance of any of these skills?
I'm an Enneagram 4.
Okay. Oh, that's neat. Oh my gosh, I love hearing that. Um, because my eldest just came back from who is a for Ringling College of the Arts here in the Tampa, Sarasota area of Florida. And she's like, oh my gosh, I just met with an artist who informed her as you're finishing up and becoming a senior in college. She said, your art will find you and you will find a way to bring it in. And it just reminded me of what you just shared about how your artistry really was part of everything you were doing and how your prayers met your artistry. That's so beautiful. It makes so much sense that you're a four.
Yeah, it's there's a deep desire for creative expression. And as we get older and start to feel more responsibility in our lives, I think that as artists, we can sometimes deprioritize
Mhm.
our creative gift because it feels impractical
Mhm.
and is very time consuming. And
Mhm.
so I know that for me, like, yeah, just discovering my purpose in helping to impact the world brought these two things together in this really beautiful way. And I didn't have, the right mentorship when I was younger
Mhm.
to kind of like guide me with some of these things that I've come to discover.
Yeah.
Uh, but but yeah, I think that the the arts are one of the most beautiful and powerful ways that we can help bring change into the world. Um, Teachers are called to help people know what to think. And
Mhm.
artists are called to inspire people to think. And
Mhm.
so I think that sometimes the ambiguity of the arts can be its gift because it invites people to discover beauty in the place of mystery. And
Mhm.
and when people are disarmed in that way, I think it's a really potent context to communicate truth that has the potential to produce a transformational experience. And so
Mhm.
that's been our journey with our films is creating these high impact, human trafficking is such a high stakes problem
Mhm.
and it really demands, a high impact response. So
Mhm.
we create these high impact films and follow them up with high impact campaigns that
Mhm.
ultimately produce deep systemic change.
Mhm.
We often say this phrase that films change people and people change the world. And
Mhm.
so a big part of our story has been inviting people to learn about this issue through these cinematic stories that communicate truth and really end up helping to shift people's perspective of the world and even what they feel called to do in the world. And so, yeah.
Oh my goodness. I know people are really going to love your film if they haven't, and in a deep dive way that allows them to see more clearly how these systemic issues are even getting their start. Now, you were maybe not mentored in a way early on that led you here, and you found a circuitous path, of course, like many of us. And in the faith community, we often remember that our weakness comes through and Christ's power shines through that. But um, I love that you allowed yourself to be led. And I also read that you liked William Wilberforce as somebody that you had obviously read and heard of in the abolitionist movement. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about what about his story inspired you to help others? Since, of course, you said human trafficking, you had no idea it would come to you as this big mission.
Right. Yeah. Wilberforce lived at a time when slavery had been accepted for you know, I mean, for as long as humankind had been on the earth. And so at the time that he was alive, it was a very, very deeply embedded um, social and economic reality. And so Wilberforce's journey is one where he discovered the deeper truth about what was happening in the slave industry. So
Yeah.
much like today, the pro-slavery movement
Mhm.
was presenting a cover narrative that slavery was, this great institution, that it added all kinds of economic benefit, that life in the West Indies was, Americas was actually better for slaves than it was in the harsh conditions of Africa, that,
Yeah.
they presented the trip across the transatlantic like it was some luxury voyage.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
so these ideas fed into people's predisposed, you know, um, wanting to believe that it was all okay
Mm,
in order for the economic machine to keep moving forward.
mm,
And so it was Wilberforce who brought out the deeper truth of the injustice that was happening in slavery.
mm,
And um, and so when Eric Metaxas writes about William Wilberforce in his book Amazing Grace, he
mhm,
says that the thing that made Wilberforce the greatest reformer in the history of the planet is not that he vanquished slavery, it's that he vanquished the mindset that permitted slavery for millennia.
mm,
So he was quite literally a hinge of history in that sense of shifting the locus of thought and the mass consciousness of society in order to pave the way for legislation that would concretely eradicate slavery from the world. And so, in a similar way, um, we're dealing with that today with the reality of the sex trade. And it's interesting because Victor Hugo came along shortly after Wilberforce died, and he said, "We say that slavery has vanished from European civilization, but this is not true.
mm,
Slavery still exists, but now it applies only to women, and its name is prostitution."
mm,
So he put his finger on this idea that men had given up their entitlement to subjugate, oppress, and exploit other men through the system of slavery,
mm,
but they had not given up their entitlement to subjugate, oppress, and exploit women through the system of prostitution.
mhm,
Fast forward 150 years, and we see all of these trends suddenly emerge in our world with globalization and technology and the hardwiring of the internet around the world and the mainstreaming of pornography. And then suddenly there's just been this explosion of demand for illicit
mhm.
sex um, all around the world. Not a few bad apples, but
Mm,
large demographics of men in every society in every country around the world who have become sex buyers. And so there are, you know, enough predators out there willing to exploit the vulnerability of others in order to cash in on that demand. And so what we see is a $100 billion sex trafficking industry,
mm,
42 million people trapped in the sex trade, and the most unimaginably, grave um, situation of exploitation that you could possibly conceive of. And so I think that for us, we felt such an urgency from early on to really do everything that we could to bring an end to this.
mhm,
And the films have been just, yeah, one very significant part of that. But we do other things as well in the area of intervention, bringing people out, um, trauma therapy, so on and so forth. So
mm. It's incredible. And I'm so glad that you're finding these roots and looking at the journey from every angle. You guys are so thorough in making sure that you also understand, like you said, the big history, what's happened, and also as we talk today, the individual narrative. So we're taking this big view out, this aerial view, but then we're going to get into some nitty gritty as well, because your movie Buying Her really, I know you worked on it for years. It's seen in that way that you can see that you are helping us to understand, how does this happen to somebody that they could ever subjugate another human like this? Tell us a little bit about that movie and how people can access it, because I think it'll help people to understand this is a large number of people, first of all, that are in trafficking. And I believe the stats you have them for us, 1 out of every 5. But tell me more about all of this. And I would love to just have our listeners learn more about the movie.
yeah, so during the time that we were making Nefarious, my first documentary, again, we were investigating the problem of sex trafficking in all
Mhm.
these. We traveled across 4 continents, 19 countries, and 42 cities,
Wow.
investigating these issues. And we're able to begin to see the role that demand was playing in
Mhm.
creating this multi-billion-dollar industry. And so the realization that if men stop buying women and children for sex, that the whole entire sex trade would implode overnight, and we would
Mhm.
see the largest exodus of human beings from systematic oppression that the world has
Mhm.
ever seen. So that sort of became the compelling thought for us in wanting to talk to buyers about, you know, how did you get here? So I don't believe that someone just wakes up one day and decides to go buy a woman or child for sex.
Right.
There's a socialization process that happens that brings them to a point where that then becomes the outworking of other things that have been growing in their heart, usually for decades.
Mhm.
So what the common thread that we saw among all the sex buyers, regardless of, they come from so many different walks of life, professions, family men, so on and so forth. But the one thing that united all of them was early childhood exposure to pornography. So a
Mhm.
pornography addiction that grew through their life to the point where then they began to act out on a lot of the fantasies that they were cultivating through their pornography consumption all these years. So it's a complicated story because we see something like human trafficking, and we want there to be a villain, and
Mhm.
and so it's easy to look at the men and think, well, these evil men are the one who need
Mhm.
to be held responsible. And
Mhm.
for sure, there needs to be much higher standards of accountability for anyone who would purchase another human being. We advocate for the abolition model of legislation that makes the purchase of sex a felony level offense.
Mhm.
But when we began to interview these men, what we discovered was, this reality that a lot of them had their sexuality hijacked um, as children. And so that puts a different lens on it when you understand that, well, yes, they need to be held accountable for their actions as an adult, but they also were victimized in the process as children through inadvertent exposure to pornography.
Mhm.
And so what buying her invites us into as viewers is to wrestle with this phenomenon that's happening in our world, and really poses the question of, if we want to end sex trafficking, are we willing to do what it takes to eradicate the underlying thing that's fueling it, which is pornography? And so we at Access Cry are working on a campaign right now called Protect Children, Not Porn,
Mhm.
about
Mhm.
requiring age verification um,
Mhm.
laws to be in place in every state and country around the world.
Mhm.
And basically, what that would do is require a third-party verification system in which someone has to put in a government-issued ID in order to access any kind of pornographic content online.
Mhm.
And so I think, for us, that's a good starting point, just to, start to kind of curb some of this explosion of demand that we've seen happen in this pornographic age that we're living in.
Mhm. Oh my goodness, I'm so glad. And I've seen you've already had some success in several states. And yet, like you said, it's getting so much worse. I'm hearing the founders of some of these big sites say, oh, who cares if it ruins men's chances for healthy erection because they can just have big pharma fix that, and just an absolute disregard for human, even like you said, the humans involved in viewing pornography. And I also appreciate how you are reminding us that there's this sense that even as far back as Wilberforce, et cetera, that people had said, oh, this is good for people. And now there's this whole group of people involved in pornography who say, I love doing this and I want to make it legal. If I love getting paid for it, we have people advocating for this to be legalized. What have you guys seen around that side as we, look at the male perpetrators often? What are you seeing about this other side? I'm so perplexed by that.
Well, just, there were slaves who said, that
Mm,
don't rock the boat. We
sure.
have our family on this plantation. Sure, you know, the labor is difficult, but it will be better for us than if we should just be
Mhm.
exposed to the harsh, conditions of life as they currently are.
Yeah.
Just because somebody has bought into a mindset about something doesn't make it healthy. And so I think that first and foremost, we have to understand human trafficking through the lens that this is an exploitation of vulnerability. And so there are a
Mhm.
lot of things that predispose someone towards the vulnerability that would, you know, be a precondition for trafficking. And that could be anything from being marginalized within a certain racial demographic. That could be something as being stateless, being suffering sexual abuse as a child, um, having
Mhm.
access to social media and devices from a young age, um,
Mhm.
just growing up in this hypersexualized, objectifying culture that we live in has its own sort of conditioning element that predisposes one towards the predatory aspects of the sex industry.
Mhm.
But the sex industry is predatory through and through. Um, there's a reason why people are getting paid, right, to do this. It's because you have a person there who desires the sex and a person there who does not desire the sex. Therefore,
Mhm.
payment takes place.
Mhm.
So the entire agreement of the prostitution contract is one of gender inequality, and
Mhm.
it's one of exploitation. So if you, because sex and desire are inextricably linked.
Mhm.
So if you have sex without desire, you're going to experience that as exploitation, regardless if somebody's getting paid for it. The
Mhm.
money is just a bribe meant to keep the person silent about the exploitation that's happening to their body. So
Mhm.
if you have two people who enter a room,
Mhm.
one who's there who wants the sex and one who's there who doesn't, right?
Mhm.
He puts the money on the table and says, you can take the money and leave, or you can stay for the sex. Right? She's going to
Mhm.
take the money and leave. She does not want that, nor does she want the man who's coming after him and after him and after him and after him. So she experiences these sexual encounters as a form of sexual abuse. So we at Access Cry do not try to define in and out who is a worthy or unworthy victim. Everyone who ends up in the sex trade experiences it as a form of gender inequality, violence, and exploitation. I mean, violence is essentially universal, just you know,
Mhm.
in 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 um, the sex trade. So
Mhm. Mhm.
I talked one time with a young woman who had been trafficked at the age of 14.
Mhm.
And she told me an interesting story. She was grew up in just sort of a normal suburban home,
Yeah.
um, middle class America,
Mhm.
um, but watching MTV and right, believing all of these things about what it means to be a woman in our world. So we have to factor in the role that stories play in the process of our socialization, the way in which we internalize stories and the construction of of our values, of our worldview, of our sense of identity.
Mhm.
And so something that's unique in our day and age is that the predominant stories being told are not those passed down through oral traditions of the gatekeepers of society who have an interest in preserving and protecting our society. They
Mhm.
are being told by corporate media entities whose bottom line is financial. And so we're getting a lot different stories than people have traditionally grown up with.
Mhm.
And what she said is that she met this guy who promised he could get her a job as a model and to be her boyfriend. And she ends up running away with this guy at 14. And he
Mhm.
takes her to a hotel room where he flips the script, and there's another woman there. And now this young lady is going to have to um, go be sold out on the streets of Atlantic City.
Mhm.
And so they give her this provocative attire and they put her out on the streets of Atlantic City to be sold. And, trying to wrap my mind around this,
Mhm.
I asked her, I said, you know, 14 years old,
Mhm.
believing you're running away with your boyfriend and having this promising modeling career, then finding yourself being sold out on the street, what did it feel like that moment? And she said, oh, I felt empowered. And I was so shocked, and I was like empowered. I was like, how did explain that to me? She said, no, I felt empowered. She goes, because I thought that if people wanted to pay to have sex with me, that meant that I had value. She said, so I was groomed by my culture long before I was groomed by my trafficker.
Mm,
So our entire culture right now is operating as a form of grooming young
mhm,
women into the mindsets that predispose them towards being preyed upon by the, you know, stakeholders of the sex trade. And that's also a lot of what we see happening today. The truth is, though, like I said, is that once people come into those positions find out very quickly that you can't escape the exploitation and violence that exists in the porn industry, the
mhm.
sex industry, the sex trade at large. It's inescapable.
Well, thank you for just eloquently stating that, sharing a deep story to make it personal, and really helping because it's, to me, sad but necessary for articulation and accuracy nowadays that we allow ourselves to grapple with the fact that this is something people are now celebrating. And just to get inside of that, thank you. You gave us a chance to sit with her and what that was like to be her. And also to help everyone here in case they have also been informed by that lens that I brought up, that this is not anything empowering. It's the exact opposite, even if at first people believe that. So, and now you're also letting us, this is the most, raw movie in the way that it's also getting people in the mind of him. And you're seeing, as you said, men, sometimes women, but largely here, men, feeling powerlessness, attacked, often I saw in the movie just feeling just bullied themselves. And then now they're, we know that pornography is this lust for power largely and being important and valued on that side of things. So when you did catch up with these guys, some of them had felonies. I was just amazed that they shared so openly on the film, but and all the guys you catch up with, what are you finding has been a big part of the healing for them? I know that I've heard your talks with Jay Stringer. We've had him on the podcast a couple of times, but what are you finding about doing emotional work for these perpetrators that helps them to stop the cycle of porn use and of exploitation of women?
Yeah, I really appreciate the work of Jay Stringer. They focus
Mhm.
on people telling their sexual story and getting familiar with their own story and unpacking that. Um, and I think that's a really valuable uh, process for people to sort of get in touch with the journey of their own sexual experience in the world. And for us, we've seen this play out differently for different men, but I think the one common thread for these men who have been able to come out of these situations where they were participating in this is just having a moment of accountability. And so um, the kind of behavior, you know, the the um, con the consumptive cycle of pornography is rooted in a lot of shame.
Mhm.
And so there's this relationship that you see play out between shame and behavior where somebody is developing feelings of shame um, and about the things that they're seeing. And then you know, acting on that with this behavior that then triggers the shame, and then the shame triggers the behavior, and there's this ping pong relationship that happens back and forth. So that can become a really vicious cycle, and there's
Mhm.
uh, an intensification of that happens that I think oftentimes drives people deeper and deeper and deeper into this darkness. So what we saw was like this snowball effect in these men's lives. But eventually, in most cases, there's a point where it all kind of unravels. And
Mhm.
whether that be through being found out by a spouse or being arrested. We've seen, men who, were raided by the FBI for having, you know, large amounts of child porn on their site, or men who had reached a point where they finally wanted to act out their porn fantasy and rape someone and were caught, or like I said, being found out by a spouse. Um, so I think that that aspect of accountability plays a big role in creating an opportunity for someone to come out of that and then start down their path of healing and restoration. What we're trying to do now with the Protect Children Not Porn campaign is um, just trying to protect the experience of childhood for the millions out there so that they don't have to deal with this problem, you know, however it develops in their life. And right now it is a problem for most people. Pornography exposure is virtually universal now. And we're doing another documentary on female exposure to porn because that's a problem that is a very large problem that doesn't get talked about. And so women who struggle with porn addiction feel very isolated, oftentimes attempt to commit suicide, get trapped in these same cycles of shame. I also wrote a book called Raised on Porn, where we frame an understanding of what porn is and how it affects us. And then the second half is basically how to get free from it. And so there are certain things that we prescribe for someone who would, be trapped in this vicious cycle of porn consumption and decide for themselves, I want to get free from this. And so I think the book can be really helpful towards that end.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And I saw that book, and I'm very happy that you're realizing that everybody is touched by it in some way, and somebody shows it to them at some point. And I love that this newer campaign is focusing in on women. I see that with a lot of the teen girls I've mentored. I see that with certain Enneagram types in particular. I see that with just the youth at large. I've experienced it myself as a youth. I think that you're helping us to see this is not, your child is not immune. Most people think they are. Just, my child's never seen it, my child's never been exposed. And you're saying that can be a possibility if your child doesn't have technology exposure, and you're working so hard to make sure that doesn't happen. But be aware that it happens to many, if not most, at some point. And it's also important that you told us the way people are finding freedom is through these conversations of accountability. Sometimes they're very hard conversations, sometimes they're legal conversations. And of course, like you said, you're following Jay Stringer's work, and we're all realizing these shame cycles. What about pastors and leaders? We have a lot of people listening who are in leadership positions. What do you recommend on how they get connected with Exodus Cry so they can gain more information about this?
We're very active on Instagram. So we put out a lot of um, calls to action through our Instagram page as far as petitions people can sign, legislation that we're trying to push for, films that we're trying to circulate. So people can also connect with us through our website at exoduscry.com. And yeah, we believe that the church plays a significant role in really helping to address some of these problems. And pastors and leaders in the faith communities are in such a unique position to be able to help push this abolition work forward, help bring awareness to what's going on, and connect people with the resources to be able to partner with frontlines organizations like Exodus Cry that are helping victims get out, helping them get healed, helping perpetrators stop what they're doing. So yeah, those are be like the two most common ways, but it's just really, really important that we hold perpetrators accountable, that we understand this as a victim-centered issue, um, the exploitation of vulnerability, and that we do everything that we can to help those who are in these exploited positions.
Thank you so much. And this is such a powerful episode. If you're out there listening, please consider ways you can help in this abolition. And also, if you're able to go to the gala or be involved in that, and it's Saturday, October 26th.
Yeah.
And this is a place where people are meeting. I'm sure it's limited attendance. I don't know if there's still openings and or if there will be by the time this airs, but information about that is on the site.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Where can people find you in general? You said Instagram, the book,
Yeah.
all of that's in the show notes, and then also at the website.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you
Thank you
so
so much.
much, Benji, for your work, for the movie, for everything you have to help us to learn more about this. This is so crucial. We just can't thank you enough.
Thank you so much, Krista. It's great talking with you. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Mhm.